The Golden Leader, Saparmurat Niyazov's Turkmenistan, Part 1, Early Life and Childhood Struggles. Saparmurat Niyazov's life began in a modest village on the outskirts of Ashgabat, the capital of the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic, Turkmen SSR, on February 19, 1940. The village, known as Gypjak, or Gypjak in Russian transliteration, was home to a close-knit community predominantly consisting of members of the Teak tribe, one of the most prominent Turkmen tribes. This tribal connection was a vital part of Niyazov's identity, and it played a significant role in shaping his future, as tribal affiliations were deeply ingrained in the social fabric of Turkmenistan. Throughout his life, he would invoke his tribal roots as a means of connecting with the people and establishing his legitimacy as a national leader. Niyazov's early years were marked by profound tragedy and adversity, circumstances that would profoundly shape his worldview and character. His family's narrative, as officially recorded in his biography, portrays a tale of sacrifice and loss. According to the state-approved version, his father, Saparmurat Niyazov, died heroically while serving in the Soviet Red Army during World War II, fighting against Nazi Germany. This version of events framed Saparmurat as a martyr for the Soviet cause, a man who gave his life in the global struggle against fascism. This narrative was later used to bolster Niyazov's image as a leader born from a lineage of patriotism and self-sacrifice. However, alternative accounts paint a different picture of Saparmurat's fate. Some sources suggest that he may have evaded military service during the war, a grave offense in the eyes of Soviet authorities, and was subsequently sentenced by a military tribunal. The truth remains shrouded in ambiguity, as is often the case with the personal histories of prominent political figures. What is certain, however, is that the absence of his father left a profound void in young Saparmurat's life. Tragedy struck the Niyazov family once more in 1948 when a devastating earthquake ravaged Ashgabat and the surrounding areas. The earthquake, which remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in the region's history, caused widespread destruction and claimed the lives of tens of thousands of people. Among the victims were Niyazov's mother, Gurbansultan Ege, and his two brothers. Gurbansultan Ege, whose name would later become a symbol of national pride and reverence under Niyazov's leadership, was an important figure in his early life. Her untimely death left young Saparmurat an orphan, thrusting him into a precarious and uncertain future. The earthquake's aftermath was chaotic, with survivors struggling to rebuild their lives amid the ruins. For Niyazov, the loss of his immediate family meant that he had to rely on the state and extended family for support. Initially placed in a Soviet orphanage, he experienced the regimented and often austere environment typical of such institutions. These orphanages were designed to provide shelter and education for children who had lost their families, but they were also places where discipline and conformity were heavily emphasized. It was within this setting that Niyazov began to develop the resilience and adaptability that would later characterize his political career. After some time, the state arranged for Niyazov to live under the care of a distant relative. This transition marked a shift from the structured, institutionalized life of the orphanage to a more familial, though perhaps equally challenging, environment. The experience of navigating these vastly different living situations likely played a role in shaping his ability to maneuver through the complexities of Soviet and post-Soviet politics. Despite the hardships of his early life, Niyazov demonstrated a remarkable determination to succeed. He completed his secondary education in 1959, a significant achievement for someone with his background. That same year, he took his first steps into public life by working as an instructor for the Turkmen Trade Union Exploratory Committee. This role, though modest, provided him with valuable experience in organizational work and public administration. It was a stepping stone that set the stage for his future endeavors in both education and politics. Eager to further his education, Niyazov pursued higher studies at the prestigious Leningrad Polytechnic Institute in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, now St. Petersburg, Russia. he enrolled in the Institute's electrical engineering program, a field that was highly regarded in the Soviet Union for its contributions to industrial and technological development. In 1967, after years of rigorous study, he earned his diploma as an electrical engineer. This accomplishment marked a significant milestone in his life, signaling his transition from a challenging childhood to a promising professional future. However, Niyazov's academic journey was not without its setbacks. Following his graduation, he sought further specialization in Russia, but his ambitions were temporarily derailed when he was expelled from an academic institution for failing to meet its rigorous standards. This experience, while undoubtedly disheartening, did not deter him from pursuing his goals. Instead, it may have instilled in him a greater determination to prove himself in other arenas. Looking back on these formative years, it is evident that Niyazov's early life was defined by a series of challenges and opportunities that shaped his character and ambitions. From the loss of his family in the devastating Ashgabat earthquake to his experiences in the orphanage and his pursuit of education in Leningrad. Each chapter of his early life contributed to the development of a leader who would later leave an indelible mark on Turkmenistan. His resilience in the face of adversity and his ability to adapt to changing circumstances would become hallmarks of his leadership style, propelling him to the highest echelons of power in his homeland. Part 2: Entry into Soviet politics and the ascent through the Communist Party. By the early 1960s, Saparmurat Niyazov had positioned himself for a political career, a path that would prove to be his true calling. In 1962, at the age of 22, Niyazov formally entered the political landscape by becoming a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU. This decision aligned with the trajectory of many ambitious young men in the Soviet Union during that era, as the Communist Party was not only the dominant political force but also the primary avenue for upward mobility and influence. From the outset, Niyazov demonstrated an astute understanding of the Soviet system's dynamics, leveraging his connections and displaying a commitment to the party's ideology. His ability to navigate the complexities of party politics allowed him to stand out among his peers. Within a relatively short period, he began to rise through the ranks of the Turkmen SSR's Communist Party apparatus. This ascent was fueled by his work ethic, strategic alliances, and a reputation for loyalty to the party's principles, a trait highly valued in the rigid hierarchy of Soviet governance. One of Niyazov's early roles of significance was as first secretary of the Ashgabat City Committee, a position that gave him considerable authority within the capital. This role was a springboard to greater opportunities, as it provided him with experience in managing urban administrative challenges and interacting with influential figures both locally and regionally. His tenure in this position was marked by his efforts to align Ashgabat's development with broader Soviet policies, a task that required balancing local interests with the expectations of Moscow. In 1985, Niyazov achieved a major breakthrough in his political career when he was appointed first secretary of the Communist Party of the Turkmen SSR, effectively the highest position within the Republic's party structure. His elevation to this post was not without drama, as it came on the heels of a scandal that had implicated his predecessor, Muhammadnazar Gapurov. The scandal, tied to corruption in the Turkmen cotton industry, prompted Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev to seek new leadership for the Republic. Niyazov, with his reputation as a hardliner and a loyal party member, emerged as the ideal candidate to restore order and Moscow's trust in the Turkmen SSR's administration. Niyazov's tenure as first secretary coincided with a turbulent period in Soviet history. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were reshaping the political and economic landscape of the USSR. However, Niyazov's approach stood in stark contrast to these reforms. Under his leadership, the Turkmen Communist Party gained a reputation for being one of the most hardline and resistant to change among the Soviet republics. While other regions experimented with greater transparency and economic liberalization, Turkmenistan under Niyazov clung tightly to the centralized, authoritarian model of governance that had defined Soviet rule for decades. Niyazov's conservative stance was not without its advantages. By resisting reforms, he maintained stability in Turkmenistan, avoiding the political upheaval and economic disarray that plagued other parts of the USSR during this period. However, this resistance also meant that Turkmenistan was ill-prepared for the seismic changes that would come with the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. In January 1990, Niyazov further consolidated his power by becoming chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Turkmen SSR, the republic's highest legislative body. This position was effectively equivalent to that of a president within the Soviet system. The dual roles of party leader and head of the legislative body placed Niyazov in a uniquely powerful position, allowing him to dominate both the political and legislative spheres of the Turkmen SSR. As the Soviet Union neared its dissolution, Niyazov's priorities began to shift. Initially, he supported the Soviet coup attempt of August 1991, an effort by hardline communists to seize control of the government and halt Gorbachev's reforms. This alignment with the coup plotters was consistent with Niyazov's long-standing opposition to liberalization. However, when the coup failed, Niyazov quickly adapted to the changing political landscape. Recognizing that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse, he began to distance Turkmenistan from Moscow and lay the groundwork for the republic's independence. On October 27, 1991, the Turkmen Supreme Soviet declared Turkmenistan's independence, marking a historic turning point for the country. Niyazov, already the most powerful figure in Turkmen politics, was appointed the republic's first president. This transition from a Soviet republic to an independent state was fraught with challenges, as Turkmenistan had little experience with self-governance and faced the daunting task of building its institutions from scratch. In the early months of independence, Niyazov sought to legitimize his leadership through popular support. On June 21, 1992, Turkmenistan held its first presidential election, with Niyazov as the sole candidate. Unsurprisingly, he was declared the winner, becoming the country's first popularly elected president. To solidify his authority further, he adopted the title Turkmenbashi, meaning leader of all Turkmen, a symbolic gesture that underscored his role as the unifying figure for the nation. The consolidation of Niyazov's power continued in 1994 when a national plebiscite extended his presidential term until 2002. This move, justified as necessary to oversee the implementation of a 10-year development plan, effectively eliminated any immediate threat to his leadership. The official results of the plebiscite claimed an implausible 99.9% approval, a figure that typified the authoritarian nature of his rule. By the end of the decade, Niyazov had secured his position as president for life. On December 28, 1999, the Turkmen parliament formally declared him to hold this title indefinitely. Parliamentary elections held earlier that month were widely criticized as a sham, with all candidates handpicked by Niyazov himself. This declaration marked the culmination of his transformation from a Soviet-era bureaucrat to an unchallenged autocrat. Part 3: The birth of Turkmenbashi's rule and the rise of a cult of personality. When Saparmurat Niyazov assumed the presidency of an independent Turkmenistan in 1991, the nation stood at a crossroads. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left the newly sovereign state with a fractured economy, weak institutions, and an identity crisis. Niyazov took the reins of power at this crucial juncture, determined to transform Turkmenistan into a stable, self-reliant country under his vision of centralized leadership. However, this vision soon evolved into a rule marked by a highly personalized system of governance and the establishment of one of the most extraordinary cults of personality in modern history. Niyazov's presidency officially began with the declaration of Turkmenistan's independence on October 27, 1991. His consolidation of power followed swiftly. As the country's first president, he positioned himself not merely as a political leader but as a symbolic figure representing unity, strength, and national pride. This transformation was evident in the titles and honors he bestowed upon himself. By 1993, he had formally adopted the title Turkmenbashi, meaning leader of all Turkmen, a name that would become synonymous with his identity and governance. In the early years of his presidency, Niyazov sought to distance Turkmenistan from its Soviet past. While other post-Soviet states grappled with economic instability and political pluralism, Niyazov charted a different course. His government retained many aspects of the centralized Soviet model, particularly in economic planning, but coupled it with a deliberate emphasis on Turkmen nationalism. This approach sought to forge a new identity for the young nation, one rooted in its historical and cultural heritage rather than its communist past. To solidify his vision, Niyazov embarked on an ambitious cultural transformation. He authored the Runama, or Book of the Soul, an eclectic work that blended autobiography, spiritual guidance, and nationalist philosophy. Published in 2001, the Runama was intended as a guiding text for the Turkmen people, offering moral and ethical instructions alongside reflections on Turkmen history and culture. Niyazov described it as a work of divine inspiration and claimed that those who read it 3 times would be guaranteed a place in heaven. The Runama's influence permeated every aspect of Turkmen life. It became a mandatory part of the school curriculum, a requirement for university entrance exams, and even a component of driver's license tests. Government employees were expected to demonstrate their knowledge of the book, and excerpts were prominently featured in state media. In many mosques, the Runama was displayed alongside the Quran, underscoring its elevated status in the national consciousness. A statue of the book in Ashgabat even opened and closed mechanically, symbolizing its omnipresence in public life. Niyazov also sought to reshape the cultural landscape of Turkmenistan through a series of symbolic decrees. In one of his most striking moves, he renamed the months of the year and the days of the week to honor Turkmen heroes, poets, historical events, and members of his own family. For example, the month of September was renamed Runama in honor of his book, while April became Gurbansultan Eid to commemorate his mother. These changes, implemented in 2002, reflected Niyazov's belief in the importance of infusing everyday life with nationalistic and personal symbolism. The renaming of months and days was just one of many measures aimed at elevating Niyazov's image. His cult of personality reached extraordinary heights, rivaling those of historical figures like Stalin and Kim Il-sung. Statues and portraits of Niyazov were erected throughout the country, from major cities to remote villages. The most famous of these was the Arch of Neutrality, a towering structure in Ashgabat crowned by a rotating golden statue of Niyazov that always faced the sun. This $12 million monument became an iconic symbol of his rule and a testament to his self-aggrandizement. In addition to statues, Niyazov's likeness adorned banknotes, stamps, and public buildings. His image was omnipresent in the media, with television broadcasts often beginning and ending with odes to his leadership. In some cases, his silhouette was even used as a logo for state-run programs. The national anthem of Turkmenistan was revised to include references to him, further embedding his persona into the country's cultural fabric. Niyazov's efforts to promote Turkmen culture extended beyond his own image. He introduced a new Latin-based Turkmen alphabet to replace the Cyrillic script used during the Soviet era, symbolizing a break from the past and a step toward modernization. The new alphabet, consisting of unique letters such as AA and was intended to reflect Turkmenistan's distinct linguistic heritage. He also established new national holidays, such as Melon Day, celebrated on the second Sunday of August to honor the Turkmen melon, which he described as a gift of God with a glorious history. While these initiatives aim to foster a sense of national pride, they also reinforce Niyazov's central role in Turkmenistan's identity. The combination of cultural revival and personal glorification created a system in which loyalty to the leader was synonymous with loyalty to the nation. This dynamic left little room for dissent or alternative perspectives. Critics of Niyazov's rule pointed to the detrimental effects of his cult of personality on governance and society. The emphasis on his image and ideology often came at the expense of practical reforms. While Niyazov spoke of transitioning to a market economy and democratic governance, these aspirations remained largely unfulfilled. State control of the economy persisted, and the political system remained tightly centralized, with no tolerance for opposition. Despite these shortcomings, Niyazov maintained a firm grip on power through a combination of propaganda, political maneuvering, and the suppression of dissent. His rule became a case study in the use of cultural and symbolic tools to consolidate authority, creating a regime that was as much about spectacle as it was about control. As the first decade of his presidency came to a close, Niyazov stood as an unparalleled figure in Turkmenistan's history. His ability to shape the nation's identity, coupled with his relentless self-promotion, ensured that his legacy would be both enduring and controversial. Part 4: Economic Policies and the Challenges of Development. As Saparmurat Niyazov solidified his control over Turkmenistan, he turned his attention to the nation's economy, a sector critical for the survival of the newly independent state. The dissolution of the Soviet Union had left Turkmenistan's economy in a precarious state. Heavily reliant on central planning during its years as a Soviet republic, Turkmenistan faced the daunting task of transitioning to a market-based system while addressing widespread poverty, limited industrial diversification, and a dependence on natural resources. Niyazov's economic policies, though ambitious in their rhetoric, revealed a tension between modernization efforts and his adherence to centralized control. Oil and gas, the backbone of Turkmenistan's economy. Turkmenistan's economy was, and remains, heavily reliant on its vast reserves of oil and natural gas. At the time of independence, the country possessed the second-largest proven oil reserves among the former Soviet republics, alongside substantial natural gas deposits. Recognizing the potential of these resources, Niyazov placed the oil and gas sector at the center of his economic strategy. Early in his presidency, he sought to capitalize on Turkmenistan's energy wealth by attracting foreign investment and modernizing the country's extraction and production capabilities. To this end, Turkmenistan invested heavily in infrastructure, building new refineries and processing plants to reduce reliance on crude oil exports and focus on producing value-added products. A notable achievement was the completion of the Korpejikord-Kui pipeline, which allowed Turkmenistan to export natural gas directly to neighboring Iran, bypassing the traditional Soviet-era routes controlled by Russia. This diversification of export routes was a strategic move to assert Turkmenistan's economic independence and increase its leverage in regional energy markets. In interviews with foreign media, including the Rossiyskaya Gazeta, Niyazov often boasted about Turkmenistan's ability to process a significant portion of its domestic oil output. He claimed that 85% of the country's production was refined locally, a figure that underscored his efforts to position Turkmenistan as more than just a raw material exporter. However, these achievements came with challenges. The country's heavy reliance on hydrocarbons made its economy vulnerable to fluctuations in global energy prices, a vulnerability that would persist long after Niyazov's rule. In an effort to demonstrate his commitment to the well-being of ordinary citizens, Niyazov issued a series of decrees providing free access to basic utilities. Starting in 1991, water, gas, electricity, and refined salt were made available to all Turkmen citizens at no cost. This policy, extended multiple times during his presidency, was framed as a gesture of goodwill and solidarity with the people. While popular among citizens, it placed a significant strain on the state budget and discouraged efficient resource usage. Agricultural policies, between tradition and modernization. While hydrocarbons dominated Turkmenistan's economy, agriculture remained a crucial sector, employing a large portion of the population. Under Niyazov, the government continued the Soviet-era practice of setting production quotas for key crops, particularly cotton and wheat. Cotton, often referred to as white gold, was a major export commodity, and Turkmenistan was one of the world's largest cotton producers. Wheat production, on the other hand, was vital for ensuring domestic food security. Niyazov's approach to agriculture was characterized by ambitious targets and strict accountability. Failure to meet production quotas often resulted in harsh penalties, with local officials and ministers frequently dismissed or publicly reprimanded. This high-pressure environment created a culture of fear and led to questionable practices, including inflated production figures and overexploitation of resources. Despite these challenges, Niyazov invested in modernizing the agricultural sector, particularly in developing a domestic textile industry to reduce reliance on raw cotton exports. By the late 1990s, Turkmenistan had established several textile factories, marking a significant step toward industrial diversification. However, these efforts were hampered by inefficiencies, corruption, and a lack of skilled labor. One of Niyazov's more symbolic contributions to agriculture was the creation of Melon Day, celebrated annually on the second Sunday of August. This harvest festival honored the Turkmen melon, a fruit he described as a gift of God and a symbol of the nation's agricultural heritage. Unlike some of his other initiatives, Melon Day continued to be celebrated after his death, reflecting its cultural resonance. The struggle between centralization and reform. Although Niyazov often spoke of transitioning Turkmenistan to a market economy, his policies remained firmly rooted in central planning. The government maintained control over key industries, including energy, agriculture, and banking, and subsidies played a significant role in the economy. Exchange rate restrictions, price controls, and direct state involvement in production decisions were hallmarks of his administration. This centralized approach created significant obstacles to private sector development and foreign investment. International observers frequently criticized Turkmenistan for its opaque business environment, lack of legal protections for investors, and pervasive corruption. While Niyazov welcomed partnerships in the energy sector, such collaborations were often tightly controlled, with the government dictating terms and retaining majority stakes in projects. Despite these shortcomings, Niyazov framed his economic policies as part of a broader vision for Turkmenistan's self-reliance and prosperity. He introduced a series of 5-year and 10-year development plans, outlining ambitious goals for infrastructure, industry, and social welfare. These plans were often accompanied by grandiose public declarations and ceremonial inaugurations, reinforcing his image as a leader committed to progress. Economic challenges and public discontent. While Niyazov's rhetoric emphasized stability and growth, the reality for many Turkmen citizens was far less optimistic. High unemployment, low wages, and a lack of economic opportunities outside the state sector created widespread hardship. Rural areas, in particular, struggled with poor infrastructure and limited access to education and healthcare. The government's focus on monumental construction projects and lavish displays of wealth often seemed disconnected from the everyday needs of the population. Critics of Niyazov's economic policies pointed to the inefficiency and inequity of his centralized system. Resources were frequently allocated based on political considerations rather than economic logic, leading to waste and mismanagement. The emphasis on loyalty over competence in government appointments further exacerbated these issues, as many officials lacked the expertise to implement effective policies. Despite these challenges, Niyazov's control over the media and public discourse ensured that dissenting voices were rarely heard. Official reports consistently portrayed the economy as thriving, with state propaganda emphasizing achievements such as the construction of new pipelines, factories, and cultural landmarks. These narratives, while often exaggerated, helped maintain the illusion of progress and reinforce Niyazov's authority. The legacy of economic policy under Niyazov. By the end of his presidency, Niyazov's economic policies had left a mixed legacy. On one hand, Turkmenistan's energy sector had grown significantly, providing the government with substantial revenue and enabling it to pursue ambitious infrastructure projects. On the other hand, the lack of meaningful reform and diversification left the economy vulnerable to external shocks and limited the country's long-term prospects. Niyazov's approach to economic management reflected his broader philosophy of governance, centralized, symbolic, and focused on maintaining control. While his policies brought some tangible benefits, they also entrenched inefficiencies and inequalities that would persist long after his tenure. Part 5: Internal Policies, Social Reforms, and Controversial Decisions. As Saparmurat Niyazov's presidency advanced, his approach to domestic governance became increasingly marked by sweeping reforms, eccentric decrees, and policies that often defied conventional wisdom. While he framed his initiatives as efforts to build a prosperous and cohesive society, many of his decisions had profound and far-reaching consequences, shaping Turkmenistan's social, educational, and healthcare systems in ways that remain subjects of intense debate. Internal policies and governance. One of Niyazov's early acts as president was the abolition of the death penalty. This decision, framed as a commitment to human rights, was hailed internationally as a progressive move, particularly in a region where such reforms were rare. However, this gesture stood in stark contrast to his government's broader human rights record. Under Niyazov, Turkmenistan was frequently criticized for its authoritarianism, lack of press freedom, and suppression of dissent. The state-controlled media played a central role in Niyazov's governance, perpetuating his cult of personality and silencing critical voices. Newspapers, television programs, and radio broadcasts were filled with praise for the president and his policies. Independent journalism was effectively non-existent, and foreign media access was tightly restricted. In this heavily censored environment, the public was inundated with positive portrayals of Niyazov's leadership, creating an atmosphere where dissent was virtually impossible. In an effort to instill discipline and national pride, Niyazov implemented a series of public health initiatives. Among the most notable was the Walk of Health, a physical fitness program designed to encourage exercise among government officials and the general population. In January 2000, Niyazov inaugurated a 37-kilometer mountain trail near Ashgabat, which he mandated high-ranking officials traverse annually. This initiative, though ostensibly aimed at improving public health, became emblematic of his penchant for imposing unusual requirements on his administration. Education, restructuring and ideological indoctrination. Education was a cornerstone of Niyazov's vision for Turkmenistan, but his approach was highly controversial. Early in his presidency, he announced plans to overhaul the education system, emphasizing the need for national pride and cultural revival. However, these reforms often prioritized ideological indoctrination over academic rigor, leading to a decline in educational standards. The most prominent example of this was the mandatory integration of Niyazov's Runama into the school curriculum. The book, a blend of autobiography, moral teachings, and nationalist propaganda, was elevated to the status of a sacred text. Students at all levels were required to study it extensively, and proficiency in its teachings was a prerequisite for university admission and government employment. This focus on the Runama came at the expense of traditional subjects, undermining the quality of education in critical areas such as science, mathematics, and foreign languages. In 1998, Niyazov closed the Academy of Sciences of Turkmenistan, citing the need to streamline state spending. This decision, which effectively halted scientific research in the country, drew sharp criticism from academics and international observers. The academy remained shuttered until 2009 when it was reopened by Niyazov's successor, Gabonguli Berdimuhamedov. Further reforms included reducing the length of mandatory schooling and eliminating many vocational training programs. These changes were ostensibly aimed at aligning education with Turkmenistan's needs, but were widely seen as efforts to consolidate control and limit opportunities for independent thought. Healthcare, a system in decline. Niyazov's approach to healthcare mirrored his broader governance style, combining grand proclamations with policies that often had detrimental effects on the population. While he frequently spoke of improving public health, his decisions frequently undermined the healthcare system. In February 2005, Niyazov ordered the closure of all hospitals outside Ashgabat, reasoning that the sick should travel to the capital for treatment. This decree left rural areas, where the majority of Turkmenistan's population resided, without access to medical care. The centralization of healthcare facilities created significant hardships for patients, particularly those unable to afford travel to the capital. The situation was further exacerbated in March 2004 when Niyazov dismissed 15,000 healthcare workers, including nurses, midwives, and school health visitors. These dismissals, justified as cost-saving measures, left the healthcare system severely understaffed and ill-equipped to address the population's needs. Adding to these challenges was Niyazov's ban on discussing contagious diseases such as HIV, AIDS, and cholera in public. This policy, driven by a desire to project an image of national health and prosperity, hindered efforts to address public health crises and increased the risk of disease outbreaks. In one of the most controversial moves of his presidency, Niyazov significantly reduced pensions for elderly citizens in January 2006. Approximately one-third of retirees lost their pensions entirely, while another 200,000 saw their benefits reduced. Moreover, recipients were ordered to repay pensions received in the previous 2 years, plunging many elderly Turkmen into financial distress. The decision was widely criticized both domestically and internationally, and Niyazov's successor reversed it shortly after taking office. Libraries, information access, and isolation, Niyazov's policies extended to cultural and intellectual life, often with damaging consequences. In an effort to prioritize the Runama and other state-approved texts, he ordered the closure of all libraries outside Ashgabat. He claimed that rural populations did not need access to books other than the Quran and the Runama. This decision effectively curtailed access to knowledge and information for much of the population. In the realm of technology, Niyazov tightly controlled internet access. By 2001, all internet cafes were closed, and the state-run Turkmen Telecom became the sole provider of internet services. These measures severely limited the population's access to global information and further isolated Turkmenistan from the international community. The cost of centralized control. While Niyazov's internal policies were often framed as efforts to strengthen Turkmenistan's sovereignty and cultural identity, they frequently came at a high cost. The emphasis on loyalty and ideological conformity over competence and expertise weakened institutions and stifled innovation. Social services, once a cornerstone of Soviet governance, deteriorated under his rule, leaving many citizens without adequate support. Despite these challenges, Niyazov maintained an unshakable grip on power through a combination of propaganda, surveillance, and repression. His policies reflected a deeply personal vision for Turkmenistan, one in which the state and its leader were inseparable. This vision, while ensuring stability, also left the country unprepared to address the complex challenges of the modern world. Part 6: Eccentric Decrees and the Expansion of a Cult of Personality. As Saparmurat Niyazov's presidency progressed, his rule became increasingly characterized by a series of highly unusual and, at times, surreal decrees that cemented his reputation as one of the most eccentric leaders in modern history. These measures, while often justified as efforts to promote cultural pride or improve societal standards, frequently served to enhance his personal cult of personality and consolidate his control over Turkmenistan. His eccentricities became a defining feature of his governance, drawing both fascination and criticism from the global community. Renaming the calendar, a nation rewritten in his image. Among the most symbolic of Niyazov's decrees was the renaming of the months of the year and the days of the week. Implemented in 2002, this sweeping reform was an attempt to infuse everyday life with Turkmen nationalism and a personal touch from the president himself. Each month was renamed to honor significant aspects of Turkmen culture, history, or Niyazov's own family. For instance, January became Turkmenbashi, reflecting Niyazov's adopted title as leader of all Turkmen. April was renamed Gurbansultan Ege, in honor of his mother, while September was dubbed Runama, commemorating his spiritual guidebook. The days of the week were similarly rebranded with Turkmen-inspired names. These changes were codified in a new labor law and became a mandatory part of official documentation, school curricula, and public discourse. While intended to reinforce Turkmen identity, the renaming campaign was widely viewed as an extension of Niyazov's self-aggrandizement, with his image and legacy woven into the fabric of daily life. Runama, the book that shaped a nation, the Runama, or Book of the Soul, occupied a central place in Niyazov's cult of personality. Written by Niyazov and first published in 2001, the book combined autobiography, historical reflections, moral teachings, and philosophical musings. It was promoted as a spiritual and intellectual guide for the Turkmen people, with claims that it contained divine inspiration. To elevate its status, Niyazov mandated that the Runama be studied in schools, used as a reference for university entrance exams, and read during official ceremonies. The book became a litmus test for loyalty, with government employees and military personnel required to demonstrate their knowledge of its contents. Copies of the Runama were distributed widely, and its presence was even institutionalized in places of worship, where it was displayed alongside the Quran. In a particularly dramatic demonstration of its importance, Niyazov claimed that reading the Runama 3 times would guarantee entrance to heaven. The book's influence extended to Turkmenistan's architectural landscape, with statues and monuments dedicated to it. The most notable example was a massive, mechanized sculpture of the Runama in Ashgabat that opened and closed daily, symbolizing the book's pivotal role in Turkmen society. Cultural policies, a vision of pure Turkmenism. Niyazov's efforts to promote Turkmen culture often took the form of bizarre and restrictive policies. Among the most notable was his ban on opera, ballet, and the circus, which he dismissed as decidedly un-Turkmen. This decision was part of a broader campaign to redefine the nation's cultural identity, emphasizing traditional Turkmen art forms over perceived foreign influences. These measures were justified as efforts to preserve the authenticity of Turkmen music, but they also reflected Niyazov's tendency to micromanage cultural expression. Niyazov's eccentric cultural decrees extended to personal grooming. In 2004, he issued an edict forbidding men from wearing long hair or beards, citing associations with Islamic extremism. This policy was accompanied by a broader crackdown on what he deemed undesirable practices, including the use of gold teeth, which he advised citizens to avoid by chewing bones to strengthen their natural teeth. Banning and building a presidency of contradictions. Niyazov's presidency was marked by a paradoxical combination of restrictions and grandiose construction projects. On the one hand, he banned activities and items he deemed unnecessary or harmful. For example, car radios were prohibited, reportedly because Niyazov found them useless. Video games, which he described as too violent, were outlawed, as was smoking in public places, a decree inspired by his own decision to quit smoking after heart surgery in 1997. On the other hand, Niyazov pursued an ambitious program of public works, commissioning monumental buildings and infrastructure projects that showcased Turkmenistan's wealth and modernity. One of the most extravagant was the construction of an indoor ice skating rink in the desert, a project he envisioned as a way for Turkmen citizens to experience winter sports. The rink, completed in 2008, became a symbol of his penchant for outlandish initiatives. Other notable projects included the Arch of Neutrality, topped with a rotating golden statue of Niyazov, and the Turkmenbashi Rui Mosque, the largest mosque in Central Asia. These structures, while impressive, often drew criticism for their cost and the cult-like reverence they embodied. Cult of personality, a totalizing vision. Niyazov's cult of personality extended beyond monuments and decrees to encompass nearly every aspect of public life. His image was omnipresent, appearing on banknotes, stamps, and billboards. Statues of him were erected in towns and cities across the country, and his name was attached to schools, streets, airports, and even a meteorite. The national anthem of Turkmenistan included references to Niyazov, reinforcing his association with the nation's identity. Physicians were required to swear an oath to him instead of the traditional Hippocratic oath, further blurring the line between governance and personal glorification. Media coverage was similarly dominated by Niyazov's persona. State-run television programs frequently featured segments praising his leadership, while news broadcasts began and ended with declarations of loyalty to the president. Reporters and anchors were prohibited from wearing makeup, ostensibly to ensure a natural appearance, but also reflecting Niyazov's idiosyncratic preferences. A legacy of spectacle and control. While Niyazov's decrees often appeared eccentric, they served a clear purpose: to reinforce his absolute authority and position as the embodiment of Turkmenistan. His ability to reshape the nation's culture, calendar, and public life demonstrated the extent of his power, but it also highlighted the risks of centralized and personalized governance. By the time of his death in 2006, Niyazov's cult of personality had reached a level that few leaders in modern history had achieved. The legacy of his rule, marked by monumental achievements and deeply controversial policies, continues to shape Turkmenistan's identity and governance. Part 7: Foreign Policy and Turkmenistan's Stance on Neutrality. Saparmurat Niyazov's approach to foreign policy was as unique and idiosyncratic as his domestic governance. From the outset of his presidency, Niyazov framed Turkmenistan's international relations around the concept of neutrality, a policy that became the cornerstone of the country's engagement with the rest of the world. This stance allowed Turkmenistan to carve out a distinctive position on the global stage, balancing its relationships with neighboring powers while avoiding entanglements in regional conflicts or alliances. However, this policy of neutrality was not without its complexities and controversies. The declaration of neutrality, a cornerstone of Turkmen diplomacy. In 1995, Niyazov achieved a diplomatic milestone when the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution recognizing Turkmenistan's permanent neutrality. This resolution, supported by 185 member states, was a triumph for Niyazov and a defining moment for Turkmenistan's foreign policy. It enshrined the country's commitment to abstain from military alliances, conflicts, and peacekeeping missions, effectively positioning Turkmenistan as an impartial actor in international affairs. Neutrality became a central theme of Niyazov's presidency, symbolizing Turkmenistan's independence from external influence. This policy was prominently featured in the country's constitution and celebrated annually on Neutrality Day, a national holiday marked by grand parades and public festivities. The Arch of Neutrality, topped with a golden statue of Niyazov, was constructed in Ashgabat as a physical manifestation of this policy, underscoring its importance in the nation's identity. Relations with neighboring powers. Balancing act in Central Asia. Turkmenistan's location in Central Asia, bordered by powerful neighbors such as Russia, Iran, and China, necessitated a delicate balancing act in its foreign relations. Under Niyazov, Turkmenistan sought to maintain positive ties with all its neighbors while avoiding alignment with any single power. Relations with Russia were particularly significant, given Turkmenistan's history as part of the Soviet Union. While Niyazov was wary of Moscow's influence, he recognized the importance of maintaining economic and political connections. Turkmenistan continued to export natural gas to Russia, a vital trade relationship that provided significant revenue for the Turkmen government. However, Niyazov's insistence on independence often led to tensions, particularly over pricing and pipeline routes. Iran, Turkmenistan's southern neighbor, became an important partner in energy cooperation. The construction of the Korpejikord-Kui natural gas pipeline, connecting Turkmenistan to northern Iran, marked a major step in diversifying Turkmenistan's export routes and reducing its reliance on Russian infrastructure. This partnership reflected Niyazov's pragmatic approach to foreign relations, prioritizing economic benefits over ideological differences. Relations with China grew steadily during Niyazov's presidency, particularly in the energy sector. China's growing demand for natural gas presented an opportunity for Turkmenistan to expand its exports, laying the groundwork for the construction of the Central Asia-China gas pipeline, which would be completed after Niyazov's death. Engagement with the West, limited but strategic. Niyazov's engagement with Western countries was limited but strategically significant. Turkmenistan's vast reserves of natural gas and oil attracted the attention of multinational corporations and Western governments, particularly in Europe and the United States. While Niyazov was cautious about allowing foreign influence in Turkmenistan, he recognized the potential benefits of Western investment in the energy sector. In 2006, the European Commission and the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament voted to grant Turkmenistan Most Favored Nation trading status with the European Union. This decision was widely seen as a move to secure access to Turkmenistan's energy resources. In return, Niyazov agreed to engage in a human rights dialogue with the EU, though critics questioned the sincerity of these commitments. Relations with the United States were more cautious. While the US expressed interest in Turkmenistan's energy resources, it also criticized Niyazov's authoritarian rule and human rights record. The relationship remained pragmatic, with energy cooperation taking precedence over political differences. Neutrality in regional conflicts, a delicate position. Niyazov's policy of neutrality was tested by the regional conflicts that plague Central Asia and its surroundings. During the Tajik Civil War, 1992 to 1997, Turkmenistan played a limited role, hosting peace talks but refraining from active involvement. Similarly, in Afghanistan, Niyazov maintained a hands-off approach, avoiding alignment with any faction while expressing support for regional stability. Turkmenistan's neutrality also extended to its military alliances, or lack thereof. Unlike many of its Central Asian neighbors, Turkmenistan did not join the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, or other post-Soviet defense arrangements. This stance was consistent with its UN-recognized neutrality but left the country somewhat isolated in terms of collective security. Criticism and challenges of neutrality. While neutrality allowed Turkmenistan to avoid entanglement in regional disputes, it also drew criticism for fostering isolation and limiting the country's influence on the global stage. Critics argued that Niyazov's policy prioritized symbolic gestures over substantive engagement, leaving Turkmenistan with few allies and limited leverage in international affairs. Moreover, Niyazov's emphasis on neutrality often served as a pretext for avoiding scrutiny of his domestic policies. By positioning Turkmenistan as a self-reliant and independent nation, he deflected criticism of his authoritarian rule and human rights violations. This approach further isolated Turkmenistan from international organizations and advocacy groups. Legacy of Niyazov's foreign policy. Saparmurat Niyazov's foreign policy left a lasting legacy in Turkmenistan. His unwavering commitment to neutrality defined the country's international identity and established a framework for its engagement with the world. While this policy allowed Turkmenistan to navigate the complexities of regional geopolitics, it also reinforced the insularity and authoritarianism of Niyazov's regime. After Niyazov's death, his successor, Gabonguli Berdimuhamedov, continued to uphold the policy of neutrality while seeking to modernize Turkmenistan's foreign relations. However, the challenges of balancing independence with global engagement remain a defining feature of Turkmenistan's diplomacy, rooted in the foundations laid by Niyazov. Part 8, Later Years, Death, and the Transition of Power. As the new millennium progressed, Saparmurat Niyazov continued to rule Turkmenistan with an iron grip, his cult of personality reaching unparalleled heights. His later years were marked by an intensification of eccentric policies, further consolidation of power, and increasing isolation, both for himself and his country. However, the aging leader also faced mounting health issues, which added an air of uncertainty to his regime and foreshadowed the dramatic transition that would follow his death. The decline of a leader's health. Niyazov's health began to decline in the early 2000s, though the exact nature and extent of his ailments were shrouded in secrecy. Publicly, the president appeared to maintain his vigor, presiding over ceremonies and issuing decrees with his characteristic flair. However, occasional absences from public events fueled speculation about his well-being. In 1997, Niyazov underwent heart surgery, reportedly due to complications from long-term smoking. Following the procedure, he announced that he had quit smoking, a decision he later enforced on government officials through a nationwide ban on smoking in public places. Despite these efforts, rumors persisted about his ongoing struggles with heart disease and other health issues, compounded by his reported overindulgence in food and alcohol. 1 month before his death, Niyazov acknowledged his deteriorating health for the first time. In a rare public admission, he stated that he had been taking heart medication for several years. This acknowledgement, coupled with his advanced age, sparked speculation about the future of Turkmenistan's leadership. The sudden death of a ruler. On December 21, 2006, Turkmenistan was plunged into shock when state television announced that President Saparmurat Niyazov had died of a sudden heart attack at the age of 66. According to official reports, he passed away at approximately 1:10 a.m. at his residence, the Turkmenbashi Palace in Ashgabat. The news was delivered with solemnity, marking the end of an era for Turkmenistan. Niyazov's death raised immediate questions about the circumstances surrounding it. While the official cause was attributed to a heart attack, opposition sources and foreign media speculated about other contributing factors, including ischemic heart disease and kidney failure. Some reports even suggested that he may have died days earlier, with the announcement delayed for political reasons. These rumors, though unsubstantiated, highlighted the opacity and secrecy that characterized his regime. A nation in mourning. In the days following Niyazov's death, Turkmenistan entered a period of official mourning. His body lay in state at the presidential palace, allowing citizens and dignitaries to pay their respects. Thousands of mourners, including foreign delegations, attended the viewing, with many displaying dramatic expressions of grief. Some individuals were seen clinging to the coffin and fainting, underscoring the deep emotional impact of his passing. On December 24, 2006, Niyazov was buried in a ready-prepared mausoleum within the Turkmenbashi Rui Mosque, located in his native village of Gypjak, approximately 7 kilometers west of Ashgabat. The mosque, which he had commissioned, was the largest in Central Asia and served as a symbol of his legacy. The funeral included a traditional Islamic prayer service, with the chief mufti leading the Jyn funeral prayer. A 21-gun salute accompanied his burial, symbolizing the 21 years he had spent as Turkmenistan's leader. The funeral was a carefully orchestrated event, blending traditional Turkmen customs with the grandeur befitting a leader of Niyazov's stature. Military personnel, government officials, and ordinary citizens came together to bid farewell to the man who had dominated their nation's political and cultural landscape. The challenge of succession. Niyazov's sudden death left a significant power vacuum, as he had not named a successor. According to Turkmenistan's constitution, the chairman of the assembly, Özgeldi Atayu, was next in line to assume the presidency. However, within hours of Niyazov's death, Atayu was arrested under mysterious circumstances, effectively removing him from contention. In a surprising turn of events, Deputy Prime Minister Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov emerged as the acting president. As head of the funeral commission, Berdimuhamedov was already in a prominent position, and his swift consolidation of power signaled a carefully managed transition. The Halk Maslahati, People's Council, announced that a presidential election would be held on February 11, 2007, to determine Niyazov's successor. Berdimuhamedov's candidacy was widely seen as a foregone conclusion, as he enjoyed the support of the ruling elite and controlled the state apparatus. On February 11, 2007, he was officially elected president with an overwhelming majority, securing 89% of the vote. While the election was ostensibly democratic, it lacked meaningful competition, as all candidates were vetted by the government. A mixed legacy and the end of an era. Niyazov's death marked the end of an era for Turkmenistan, a period defined by his larger-than-life personality and highly centralized rule. His legacy was deeply polarizing. Supporters hailed him as the architect of modern Turkmenistan, crediting him with preserving stability and fostering a sense of national identity. They pointed to his infrastructure projects, cultural initiatives, and the establishment of neutrality as evidence of his achievements. Critics, however, highlighted the darker aspects of his presidency, including widespread human rights abuses, suppression of dissent, and the decline of key sectors such as education and healthcare. The cult of personality he built was seen by many as a distraction from the country's pressing challenges, while his eccentric decrees and policies drew ridicule from the international community. In the years following his death, Niyazov's successor, Gabonguli Berdimuhamedov, began dismantling some of the more controversial elements of his legacy. The renaming of months and days was reversed, references to Niyazov in the national anthem were removed, and the Runemer's prominence in public life was reduced. Nevertheless, many aspects of his rule, including the centralization of power and the emphasis on national identity, remain deeply ingrained in Turkmenistan's political culture. A leader remembered, despite the controversies surrounding his rule, Saparmurat Niyazov remains a significant figure in Turkmenistan's history. His birthday, February 19, continues to be observed as Turkmenbashi Remembrance Day, reflecting the enduring impact of his leadership. Monuments, streets, and institutions bearing his name serve as reminders of his influence, even as the country moves forward under new leadership. Niyazov's story is one of contradictions: a leader who sought to define his nation's future while often looking to the past, a ruler who inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure, and a man whose legacy continues to shape Turkmenistan's identity in profound ways.